"Follow
I
me if
found
you
this near the
want,"
South Ridge.
the mountain man whispered.
It was
The
hers.
obese girl left her
You're
cruel
gone,
world
Sarah.
behind. The morning air of Dust Creek bit at exposed skin with the fury of a mountain winter, transforming each breath into a visible ghost that dissipated into the frigid void. Abigail Grant stood on the weathered porch of Magnolia's Dress Emporium, her fingers working mechanically through a stack of threadbare garments as the temperature plummeted below freezing. At 23 years old, she possessed the kind of beauty that existed despite itself. Kind eyes the color of autumn wheat, skin smooth as cream, and a smile that could have warmed the coldest winter night. But none of that mattered in a town where a woman's worth was measured by her waistline and the cut of her dress, where appearances were currency and she possessed nothing but debt. "Look at her, will you?" sneered Mrs. Hawthorne, passing by with her daughter in tow, their breath forming clouds of contempt. "Fat as a winter bear, and still plays house like someone would ever want her. It's pathetic, really." The daughter giggled, a sound like breaking glass. Abby's fingers stilled on the calico fabric. She had learned over 23 years of living in this God-forsaken town to let insults roll off her like rain on oilcloth. But the hurt never truly diminished. It simply accumulated layer upon layer until she felt as though she might collapse under the weight of it all, might simply crumple like the worn cloth in her hands and become one with the dust that seemed to coat everything in Dust Creek. The town itself was a wound. Population 342 souls. It sat nestled in a valley between two ridges of the Rocky Mountains, like an infection that had metastasized into permanence. The town existed primarily because of the trading post established decades ago, and the handful of miners who'd struck silver in the hills nearby. Silver that had never been enough to make anyone truly prosperous, only enough to keep them chained to the hope of future riches. Most folks who lived here had arrived with broken dreams and lower expectations, and the town had slowly whittled away whatever remained of their ambitions. Abigail's father, James Grant, had certainly embodied both those qualities. She remembered him as a shadow, more than a man, a presence that filled their small house with the stench of whiskey and disappointment, a voice that grew louder and more violent the more he drank. Her mother, Catherine, had been the light in that darkness, a school teacher with gentle hands and an endless capacity for forgiveness that Abby had never quite understood. How could her mother smile at her father after he'd raised his hand to her? How could she make excuses for his cruelty, attributing it to the circumstances of frontier life rather than to his fundamental corruption? Catherine had died when Abby was 14, succumbing to consumption in the winter of 1814. Abby still remembered every detail of that death. The sound of her mother's cough, how it seemed to rattle the very walls of their home like some external force trying to break in. The way her father had responded by disappearing into the saloon for days at a time, leaving his daughter to nurse her mother alone. She remembered the exact moment her mother's breathing had stopped, the terrible silence that followed, and the realization that she was now entirely alone in a world that had no use for grieving girls. By the time Abby turned 18, her father had drunk himself into an early grave, and she was forced to seek employment. Mrs. Magnolia, the dress shop owner, had taken her on out of what might have been pity or practicality. Abby never quite determined which. The work was relentless and humiliating. She worked 6 days a week for a pittance that barely covered her room and board, mending torn seams, taking in hems, and enduring the casual cruelty of Dust Creek's limited society. The women who came in for fittings treated her as though she were furniture, something functional but ultimately invisible, existing solely for their convenience. The cruel truth was that there was nowhere else to go. The frontier stretched endlessly in all directions, populated by dangers Abby had heard described in vivid, horrifying detail. Renegade Native Americans who supposedly scalped settlers without mercy, wild animals that could tear a person apart, starvation and disease and death by exposure. Towns like Dust Creek, for all their limitations and toxicity, offered something resembling safety. The devil you knew was preferable to the devil you didn't, or so everyone insisted. Still, as Abby worked that winter morning, her fingers mechanically folding and refolding clothes, each movement a small act of surrender, she found herself drowning in dreams of escape, not toward anything, but away from the weight of these particular limitations, away from the sound of Mrs. Magnolia's voice, away from the pitying looks of women who found her body disgusting, away from a future that seemed to stretch before her like an endless corridor of shame. The afternoon sun sat low and pale over Dust Creek when Abby ventured to the back of the shop to accept a delivery of supplies. The merchant, a gnarled man named Pettigrew, whose face resembled weathered leather, was unloading crates from his wagon when she emerged into the crystalline mountain air. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. That's when she saw him, and something fundamental shifted in the world. He stood with the casual stillness of someone completely at home in discomfort, tall and broad-shouldered in a way that seemed to dwarf everything around him, dressed in buckskin that bore the authentic patina of genuine use rather than frontier affectation. His hair, the color of dark honey mixed with silver, fell past his shoulders in a way that marked him as utterly foreign to Dust Creek's conventions. But it was his eyes that arrested her, pale gray, the color of winter itself, yet somehow not cold at all. Those eyes seemed to contain whole landscapes, vast territories of loneliness and loss, so profound that looking into them felt like gazing into an abyss. Abby recognized him immediately, though they'd never spoken a single word. Eli Stone, the mountain man who descended from the high country perhaps 3 times a year, arriving in Dust Creek like some temporal anomaly, some being from a different world entirely. He purchased salt, ammunition, supplies, then disappeared back into the wilderness as mysteriously as he'd come, leaving behind only questions and wild speculation. The town's women speculated about him with a hunger that bordered on obsession. Was he married? Had he gone mad? Had he committed some unspeakable crime that drove him to solitude? The men, meanwhile, treated him with the wary respect reserved for creatures that could kill you without breaking a sweat, that operated by rules entirely different from civilized society. Abby had seen him before at the trading post, had felt the weight of his gaze pass over her with the same indifference it granted everyone else. She certainly wasn't expecting him to notice when she stumbled over a crate's edge, her bundle of cloth tumbling to the dusty ground in a flutter of fabric. But he did notice. He crossed the space between them in 3 powerful strides and bent to retrieve the scattered materials, his movements economical and practiced, the movements of a man who never wasted energy or attention. When he straightened, holding out the bundle, His voice emerged like gravel underfoot, low and rough, but not unkind. There was something almost hypnotic in that voice. "That's heavy. Why haven't you asked someone to help?" Abby took the bundle, her heart beating irregularly in her chest like a trapped bird. This close, she could see the lines around its eyes, the small scar at his temple, the weathered texture of his skin. This close, she could smell the wilderness on him, pine smoke and leather and something indefinably free, something that seemed to carry within it the scent of endless horizons. "Nobody offers," she replied quietly, and the words came out smaller than she'd intended, almost defeated. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable as stone. Then something shifted in those gray eyes, not judgment, but perhaps recognition. The acknowledgment of someone who had lived in the margins as she had, who understood the specific isolation of being unseen. He nodded slowly, a gesture that seemed to acknowledge something beyond words, and turned to go, his work boots crunching deliberately on the frozen ground. He disappeared back toward the trading post, and Abby was left standing alone in the yard, her bundle clutched to her chest, feeling as though something fundamental had just shifted beneath her feet, as though the world had tilted on its axis. That night, alone in her small room above the dress shop, Abby found herself unable to sleep. She stared at the ceiling and replayed the encounter over and over, analyzing every detail, every word, every fraction of a second of eye contact. What had that moment meant? Had it meant anything at all, or was she simply so desperate for connection that she was imagining significance where none existed? Winter deepened its grip on Dust Creek over the following weeks, tightening like a fist around the throat of the town. Snow piled higher against the storefronts, accumulating to the height of a man's waist, and the wind that came down from the mountains carried the kind of penetrating cold that made even short journeys feel like moral struggle, like a test of one's will to survive. Abby worked longer hours as Mrs. Magnolia took on rush orders for holiday celebrations planned by the town's more prosperous families, women with money who could afford to commission new dresses for social occasions of minimal importance. The pay remained meager, a pittance that barely qualified as compensation, but Abby never complained. Complaints required a belief that change was possible, and she had nearly abandoned that belief entirely. Then came the evening that shattered what remained of her fragile resignation. Mrs. Magnolia had been in a foul mood all day, her narrow face pinched with displeasure, her voice sharp as broken glass. One of the miners had failed to pay his bill, and she'd apparently decided that Abby's presence in her shop was sufficient justification for redirecting her rage. In the late afternoon, as Abby carefully stitched a hem on a wedding dress intended for the town judge's daughter, a shallow girl named Eleanor, who had spent the fitting session criticizing every aspect of Abby's work, her needle caught wrong on a subtle snag in the fabric. The resulting tear was small, perhaps an inch, but Mrs. Magnolia's reaction was immediate and catastrophic. "You clumsy oaf!" the woman shrieked, rushing forward to examine the damage, her face flushing an alarming shade of purple. "Do you have any idea how much this fabric costs? More than you make in a month, that's certain. More than you make in a year, you worthless creature." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Magnolia. I can fix it." "You can fix nothing. You ruin everything you touch with those fat fingers of yours. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is for me? How it reflects on my business? How anyone expects me to run a successful enterprise with an incompetent like you is beyond my comprehension. She grabbed the dress from Abby's hands with such force that she nearly tore it further. You're done for the day. When I tally up what this will cost to repair, I'll be deducting it from your wages. And don't bother showing up tomorrow unless you've learned the meaning of competence. The words themselves were hardly novel. Abby had heard variations of them for nearly half her life. But perhaps because she was exhausted beyond measure, or because the winter had worn her down to almost nothing, or because some small spark of hope in her chest had chosen that moment to ignite rather than extinguish, to transform from dormant ember to consuming flame. The impact was devastating. She gathered her thin coat without a word, her hands shaking so violently she could barely fasten the buttons. As she passed through the shop's front door into the gathering darkness, Mrs. Magnolia called after her with vicious certainty, "Lord knows what you think will become of you, girl. Nobody wants a woman who looks like you, and you've got nothing but empty pockets and empty prospects. You'll die alone and unmourned. Mark my words." The words seemed to chase her down the street like physical entities, beating against her back. Abby found herself unable to breathe properly, unable to think beyond the immediate reality of her own failure. She had failed at the only job available to her. She had failed at being useful. She had failed, as she always did, at being the kind of woman that the world deemed acceptable. She sat on a bench outside the abandoned blacksmith shop, her hands shaking uncontrollably, her face buried in her palms, while the temperature dropped with each passing minute and the stars emerged overhead in impossible profusion, thousands of them, millions perhaps, all witnessing her despair. There was a park bench closer to her boarding house, but she hadn't the energy to walk even that far. She simply sat and cried and waited for the cold to finish what Dust Creek had started, to crystallize her tears and freeze her heart solid, to end this prolonged agony of existing. That's when the voice came, emerging from the darkness like a memory surfacing from deep water, like a rope thrown to someone drowning. "If you hate this place that much, why do you stay?" Abby's head snapped up. Eli Stone stood at the edge of the street, backlit by the lamplight spilling from the trading post, appearing almost mythological in his proportions and bearing. He wasn't wearing his usual buckskin, but rather a heavier buffalo coat that made him appear even larger, even more substantial, like a man who'd been carved from the mountain itself, like a force of nature given human form. Abby's voice came out hoarse from crying, barely audible. "I don't have anywhere else to go." He moved toward her with the same economical grace she remembered from their first encounter, each movement deliberate and purposeful, coming to stand directly before her. His gray eyes caught the light from above, and in them Abby saw something that made her breath catch entirely. Not pity, which would have been unbearable, but understanding, the recognition of someone who had lived in the margins as she had, who understood the specific weight of being rejected by the world. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of absolute certainty, the voice of someone who had made decisions and lived with their consequences. "Follow me if you want." The statement hung in the frigid air between them, laden with possibility and danger in equal measure. His voice was quiet, carrying no force, but neither did it contain any uncertainty. It was not a question or a plea. It was a statement of fact, offered without embellishment or false promises, without the seductive lies that might make departure seem safer than it actually was. Abby stared at him, her mind reeling with the obvious questions. Who was he really? What did he want from her? Where was he going? What awaited her in the wilderness beyond the town's fragile boundaries? But underneath all of that rational fear was a deeper certainty. This moment represented a crossroads. Stay and become Mrs. Magnolia. Stay in this town and disappear into Dust Creek's particular brand of cruelty. Become a cautionary tale whispered by future generations. Stay and die unmourned and unknown, just another woman of no consequence, just another body that would rot unmissed. Or follow this strange man into the darkness. Follow him into the unknown. Follow him into potential annihilation or liberation, and either way, choose something rather than accept this. She rose slowly, her legs stiff with cold and despair. I will, she said, and her voice grew stronger as she spoke. I'll follow you. They left within the hour, riding north into the mountain darkness on horses that knew their way through the pass even without moonlight to guide them, as though the animals themselves were part of the wilderness rather than mere tools of transportation. Abby had possessed only the clothes on her back and a small bundle containing 2 changes of underwear and her mother's silver locket, the only physical remnant of the woman who had loved her unconditionally. Eli had simply nodded when she returned with this meager collection, offering no comment, no judgment, only acceptance. The ride consumed the entire night, an odyssey through darkness and freezing air. They climbed steadily, the elevation increasing with each hour, the air growing thinner and colder, until Abby could see her breath crystallizing before her face like small ghosts being born and immediately departing. The landscape transformed around them, the sparse trees of the valley giving way to dense forest, then eventually to the twisted smaller trees that clung to the higher elevations. She began to wonder if this act of freedom wasn't simply trading one form of suffering for another, if she'd exchanged the psychological cruelty of Dust Creek for the physical cruelty of the wilderness. Her legs ached in a way she'd never experienced, a deep, muscular pain that seemed to penetrate to her very bones. Her hands grew numb despite her efforts to keep them moving. Her back screamed with the unfamiliar strain of riding for such extended periods. More than once, she found herself questioning the sanity of her choice, wondering if she should demand to return to town, wondering if even Dust Creek would be preferable to this. But then something unexpected happened. As they crested a ridge, just as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the wilderness opened before her in all its terrible magnificence. Mountain after mountain stretched toward the horizon, their peaks brilliant with snow, their slopes carved by geological forces that had operated for millions of years. Stands of pine and spruce covered the lower elevations in dark green sentinels that seemed to stretch toward infinity. A valley lay below them, partially shrouded in mist that clung to the earth like a living thing, and she could hear the sound of running water, a river perhaps, or a substantial stream, the voice of the wilderness itself calling to her. There, Eli said, breaking a silence that had persisted since they'd left town, his voice carrying a note of something almost like affection. He pointed to a column of smoke rising from the far side of the valley, a thin thread connecting earth to sky. That's where we're going. That's home. How far? Abby asked, her voice hoarse from cold and disuse, and the thin air at this elevation. 2 more hours. We'll make camp before dark. You're doing well. Most people would have fallen off their horse by now." She wasn't sure if it was his words or the genuine tone of approval in his voice, but something shifted within her. She had endured. She was capable of endurance. Perhaps she was capable of more than she'd believed possible. They descended into the valley, following a path that seemed to exist more in Eli's mind than on the actual ground. Each switchback carefully negotiated, each steep section navigated with practiced ease. Abby became acutely aware of every physical sensation, the ache in her thighs, the bitter cold that seemed to penetrate her skin despite the layers she wore, the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves on the earth, and underneath it all, an almost painful awareness of her own aliveness. How long had it been since she'd felt truly present in her own body, aware of anything beyond the constant undercurrent of shame and rejection? How long since her body had been anything except a source of humiliation? When they finally stopped, the sun had begun its descent toward the western ridges, painting the sky in shades of gold and deep purple, crimson and orange, colors so vivid they seemed impossible, as though nature itself was celebrating their arrival. Eli led her to a small clearing beside the rushing stream, where he efficiently gathered wood with movements that suggested he'd performed these tasks thousands of times. He arranged the wood with the precision of an architect designing a building, and soon had flames dancing into being, consuming the logs with hungry intensity. "Hungry?" he asked, producing a pack of jerky and some hard biscuits from his saddlebag, along with a tin cup and a pot for brewing tea. Abby was ravenous, her body's needs finally overwhelming her emotional exhaustion. She ate without pretense or the ladylike manners Mrs. Magnolia would have demanded, tearing into the jerky with an abandon that would have horrified Dust Creek's polite society. The food tasted like freedom, like possibility, like the physical embodiment of her escape. That night, sleeping on a bedroll of pine branches covered with blankets that still carried the warmth of the fire, Abby listened to the river and the wind in the trees and the distant call of some nocturnal creature, and allowed herself, for the first time in years, to imagine that things might actually be different, that she might actually survive this, that she might actually become something other than what Dust Creek had tried to force her to be. The cabin, when they finally reached it 3 days later, was built from logs so old that they'd begun to blend with the landscape, as though the structure had grown from the earth rather than been constructed upon it. It sat in a clearing beside a larger stream, with a corral for horses positioned nearby, and a small smokehouse that spoke of long winters and careful preservation. The interior was sparse, but scrupulously clean. A single large room with a stone fireplace that dominated one wall, a bed frame strung with rope, a sturdy table, shelves holding carefully organized supplies, and a collection of traps and tools hanging from the walls in deliberate order. Everything spoke of a man who had imposed order on wilderness through discipline and intention. "This is home," Eli said simply, as though offering her a kingdom. Over the following weeks, Abby learned what home actually meant. Not a place of judgment and cruelty, but a structure of survival, and gradually, something approaching genuine comfort. Eli taught her systematically, with patience that revealed depths of his character she hadn't suspected. He taught her to gather firewood efficiently, to identify which trees burned best, which kindling caught fastest. He showed her how to mend the small tears that constantly appeared in cloth and leather, how to reinforce seams before they failed, how to maintain equipment before it broke. More importantly, he taught her that her body, which had been a source of shame in Dust Creek, was actually capable of considerable utility and even strength. One afternoon, as they worked to move a fallen log from near the cabin, she found herself struggling with it despite genuine effort. "You're trying too hard," Eli said, demonstrating the correct leverage point. "You're treating your body like it's an enemy. It's not. It's a tool. Use it properly, and it will accomplish remarkable things." "I've never been strong," she said quietly. "You're stronger than you know," he replied, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "You've just spent your life apologizing for existing. That doesn't require strength. It requires submission. Submission weakens us. Strength requires that we stop diminishing ourselves." She began to understand something profound in his words, that she had been choosing to be diminished, had accepted the labels applied to her as though they were immutable facts rather than the baseless opinions of limited people. The recognition was transformative, like watching scales fall from her eyes. She had the power to choose differently. Her body wasn't the problem. The world's judgment of her body was. And the world's judgment only mattered if she permitted it to. Eli, for his part, seemed to move through the world with a kind of deliberate solitude that gradually revealed itself as loneliness so profound it was almost palpable. He was skilled and self-sufficient, certainly, a man who could survive anything the wilderness threw at him. But Abby began to notice the small details that spoke of his internal landscape, the way his eyes would linger when she smiled, as though the sight of happiness startled him, the care he took to ensure she was always warm and well-fed, the way he positioned himself between her and any potential danger, as though her safety had become essential to him. One evening, in late spring, as they sat by the fire while rain drummed on the cabin's roof with hypnotic intensity, he finally spoke about his past, the words emerging as though they'd been trapped within him for years, desperate for release. "I came out here because I couldn't bear civilization anymore," he said quietly, staring into the flames as though they contained his history. "My wife died 15 years ago now. Influenza. We were going to have a child, a son, the doctor said. Didn't make it past the 6th month." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I tried to stay in society afterward, tried to function as though I hadn't lost everything that mattered, but everywhere I looked, I saw what we'd lost, what I'd never have. The wilderness asks nothing of me except competence. It doesn't demand that I pretend to be happy or celebrate milestones that should have belonged to someone else." Abby reached across and took his hand, feeling the calluses earned through years of labor, the warmth of another human being choosing connection over isolation. "You're not pretending anymore," she said simply. He turned to look at her, and in his gray eyes she saw the moment shift, the moment when loneliness recognized itself in another person and decided it no longer had to exist alone. When two broken people realized that their brokenness might actually complement rather than compound. "No," he agreed softly, his voice carrying the weight of transformation. "I'm not." They were married by a traveling priest who came through the valley in the summer of 1821, conducting the ceremony in a small clearing beside the stream where they'd first made camp together, with only the mountains and the sky and the endless wilderness as witnesses. Abby wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Eli had brought back on one of his supply runs to a settlement 2 days' ride away. It was simple and practical, suited to the life they were building, constructed of sturdy material that would last, and it was absolutely perfect in its authenticity. The priest, a weathered man named Father O'Brien, who'd traveled the frontier for decades, performed the ceremony with genuine warmth, recognizing in this unlikely pairing something sacred. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Eli kissed her with a tenderness that belied his mountain-hardened exterior, a kiss that felt like a vow beyond words. By the following spring, Abby was pregnant. She discovered it in the way women do, through the strange alchemy of her body, through sensations that felt both foreign and somehow inevitable. The baby grew within her, and with each passing month she felt her identity shifting once again. She was no longer just the woman who'd escaped Dust Creek. She was becoming a mother. The labor began on a snow-thick night in January 1823, when the cold was so intense that even the trees seemed to crack audibly in the darkness. Eli had traveled to the nearest settlement to fetch supplies and a midwife, but a sudden storm had delayed him. When the pains began in earnest, only Abby and an elderly woman named Mrs. Keene, who'd been staying at the cabin recovering from illness, were present. Mrs. Keene proved surprisingly capable, calling on knowledge accumulated through 7 decades of frontier living. She guided Abby through the process, offering encouragement and practical assistance, and when the moment came, Eli burst through the cabin door with his usual timing, snow clinging to his coat and face. The birth was difficult, but ultimately successful. Their son, a boy they named James, after her father, though they both silently hoped he would be nothing like him, entered the world with a wailing cry that seemed to shake the cabin itself. Eli's hands were steady as he severed the cord, his eyes alight with wonder as he held his son for the first time. Abby, exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure, felt something fundamental reorganize within her. She had brought life into the world. She was capable of creation. She was no longer just a woman of no consequence. She was someone's mother. She recovered quickly, her body resilient and strong, finding in motherhood a purpose that didn't involve sacrifice or diminishment, but rather expansion. Her breasts filled with milk to nourish her child. Her arms proved strong enough to hold him through the night. Her body, which had been treated as a liability in Dust Creek, became a source of sustenance and warmth for her child. The transformation was complete and liberating. 2 years later, as Abby stood outside the cabin hanging laundry to dry in the mountain sun, a horse appeared on the trail leading to their clearing. She watched with growing recognition as the rider approached, his young face haggard with exhaustion and something that looked like desperation. It was her brother Thomas, now 14 years old, half frozen and barely alive, his clothes torn and his eyes wild with the memory of trauma. Behind him came Mary on a borrowed horse, 16 years old and trying desperately to appear brave, and young William, only 10, riding double with a traveling merchant who'd agreed to help them reach this remote location. Their father had been dead for years, drunk himself to death like so many others, and their mother's family had scattered to the winds. Thomas had been apprenticed to a blacksmith in a distant settlement, and the apprenticeship had turned into systematic abuse. The smith was a cruel man who beat his charges for any infraction, who starved them and worked them like animals. Thomas had finally fled, managed to contact Mary, and together they'd convinced young William to run as well. They had nowhere to go except to the sister who had vanished from Dust Creek in the winter of 1820, who was now as much a legend in the town as any frontier figure. Eli had simply nodded when Abby asked if they could stay, and the cabin had expanded to accommodate them. Thomas learned to trap and hunt alongside his brother-in-law, gradually building a life in the wilderness that was worlds away from the blacksmith's hammer. His anger slowly transformed into competence. His desperation became determination. Within a year, he was as comfortable in the mountains as Eli himself, moving through the wilderness with the confidence of someone who'd found his true home. Mary fell in love with a surveyor's son from the valley settlement who'd come through the area mapping the mountains for some distant government office. They married in the cabin the following summer, and though her husband eventually had to return to his work in the lowlands, Mary proved unwilling to leave her sister's side. She established a semi-permanent residence at the cabin, visiting her husband for a few months each year, but returning to remain with Abigail. William, youngest and most damaged by the chaos of his childhood, attached himself to young James with the devotion of someone rebuilding his faith in family. The two boys grew up together, creating their own world within the larger world of the cabin and the mountains. By 1830, the cabin had been expanded significantly. An additional room had been added for Mary and her growing family. She'd had 3 children now with her husband, who'd become increasingly willing to spend extended periods at the mountain settlement. An expanded kitchen now occupied what had once been a simple corner, and a new storage structure had been built to accommodate the increased demands of the household. What had once been a solitary refuge for a broken man had become something else entirely, a sanctuary, a place of healing, a home that drew people seeking escape and transformation. Eli had become something of a legend in the mountain communities, not just as a skilled trapper and hunter, but as a man who'd created an unexpected sanctuary, a place where people could come to learn the skills necessary for survival, where young men like Thomas and William could be remade into functional adults rather than damaged goods. On a warm afternoon in October of that year, Abby stood in the clearing with her son James, now 7 years old, teaching him to identify medicinal plants. The boy had his mother's kind eyes and his father's quiet confidence, moving through the world with an ease that suggested he'd never once doubted his own worth. He pointed at various plants as Abby identified them, his young mind absorbing information like soil absorbs water. "This one here," Abby said, pointing to a plant with heart-shaped leaves, "is good for coughs. Your grandmother, my mother, she used to make tea from this. She was a teacher, you know, smart as anyone I've ever known, and kind about it, too. She believed in the goodness of people, even when people around her weren't always good." "The grandmother I never knew?" James asked, his forehead creasing slightly in that way he had when he was thinking deeply, a gesture that broke her heart with its familiarity. "Yes, love. She died before you were born, but she was very much like you, gentle and thoughtful. She had a way of seeing the best in people, of believing that everyone was capable of redemption." Young Thomas approached from the barn, now 18, and as competent in the wilderness as Eli had been in his youth. William, at 15, had become Eli's primary partner in trapping expeditions, and the two of them moved through the mountains with the synchronization of dancers who'd performed together for years. Mary's children, 3 of them now with another on the way, treated the cabin's interior like their personal kingdom, filling it with laughter and life in a way that seemed to erase the structure's earlier solitude. "Abigail!" Eli called from the porch, where he was mending a saddle, his movements slightly slower than they'd been a decade earlier, but no less competent. "Come see this." She made her way toward him, James tumbling along at her side, his short legs working to match his mother's pace. Over the 10 years of their marriage, the lines around Eli's eyes had deepened, but so had the frequency of his smiles. He was no longer a man defined by loss, but rather by the gains he'd accumulated. A wife who understood him, a child who trusted him, siblings who'd become family, a place where loneliness held no dominion. "What is it?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. He gestured toward the valley, where the afternoon light was beginning to paint the mountains in shades of amber and rose gold and deep crimson. "Look there. That's a new settlement forming. They're saying it might become a town, maybe even establish a school eventually." Abby studied the distant collection of structures, smoke rising from cooking fires, evidence of human habitation that would have seemed threatening a decade earlier. Now it simply seemed like the inevitable progression of human expansion. "Will we go there?" she asked, curious rather than concerned. Eli shook his head slowly. "No, this is where we belong. But it's good to know we're no longer entirely alone out here. Options matter, even if we don't exercise them. It's enough to know they exist."